I do want to focus on the research and on the differences. Now, just want to add, this is not a political statement. Every time you draw a map of Britain and Ireland, you end up sort of, well, where do you put the border and which colours will you use? And you get into all sorts of interesting conversations that I had with Tom earlier on. Two Northerners were kind of sensitive to these things. But all I want to do this morning is talk to you about business, marketing and economics in terms of what we see as the differences and the similarities between consumers in Britain and Ireland, and why particularly the differences are important to you as marketing practitioners in Ireland today in terms of your planning, in terms of your investment in communications and advertising, and in terms of the opportunities that you will look to exploit and develop in the years ahead. But let me just outline what I want to talk to you about, because I think it's important to put some of this in context. So I want to talk with kind of some of the shocks and opportunity knocks in terms of the trends that we see happening in terms of the prospects for the two islands, in terms of markets, in terms of consumers, and in terms of opportunities. Then go on to what are the differences, and this is where I want to draw in particular on the research that you've received a copy of and some of the other related analyses that we've been involved in. And then finally, really just to say, what does this mean in terms of best marketing practice in 2012 for you to succeed in terms of your ambitions for securing your slice of the consumer market in Ireland this year? So it's very important to bring all of this together in terms of your business agenda and your business priorities. Let me say a little bit firstly about the wider context, what's going on right now. In terms of the economy, well, a good indicator, and this is where economists can get a bit emotional when they start talking about confidence, which is, after all, just an emotion. It's interesting when you plot British and Irish confidence. Now, different measures. I've used the ESRI measure for Ireland and the EU measure for Britain, so the axes are different. But when you overlay them, what's interesting is that when you go back to the start of 2008, which is when the recession started in Britain and in Ireland, you get this fairly similar pattern, a plunge in confidence right through to early 2009, coming back up to a certain extent through early 2010, falling back again from the start of last year through to the middle of last year. It's kind of flattened out a little bit, you might say, coming into this year. Not a whole lot of sign of improvement there, no sign of deterioration as such, but at least it's an indication that things are not getting worse, which is, I guess, a good starting point. But confidence is hugely important, and the psychology behind it in terms of what motivates or what drives the consumer is fundamentally important to you in terms of your business. And we've seen this in in a steady number of projects where we've been modeling the impact of confidence on demand, on sales, on price sensitivity, and so on. We see consumer confidence as hugely important for businesses directly in terms of what it tells you about the state of the market. Take a look, for example, sorry, jumped ahead there. There's one particular slide I wanted to emphasize, which is around the relationship between consumer confidence and retail sales. What we find is that they're highly correlated. So if you take retail sales, which is half of all consumer spending, and you overlay on top of that consumer confidence, they move almost in lockstep. So when you look at a trend here like consumer confidence, it actually gives you a guide or a clue to what's happening there in terms of prospects for the market in your particular industry where it's consumer facing. But it's important to step beyond or look beyond confidence to look at what's happening in terms of the economy. And this is important because what this story tells us here, this chart tells us, is that we've been on very divergent paths in terms of our economic prospects in Britain and Ireland since 2007. Both countries went into recession in 2008, 2009. Britain came out of recession in 2010, bounced back quite strongly. Last year, broadly similar pattern. This year, as you can see, very weak GDP growth. Now, despite being an economist by training, I'm always struck by the old saying that, economic forecasters have a sense of humour because they use decimal places. I would take all economic forecasts with a pinch of salt right now in terms of what it tells us. But nevertheless, it's a useful guide to prospects for the market overall. When this feeds through into consumer spending, then we'll start to see some of the recovery that we're all looking for, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the important thing is that the two economies have had quite divergent experiences. We've had obviously a much sharper contraction. Britain has had more of a cyclical downturn followed by a recovery. When you look forward beyond this, both economies expected to have some recovery in the next number of years, but actually quite weak. Surprisingly similar issues around levels of government debt, borrowings, balanced budgets, all of those kind of things come through quite strongly. But that's just the economic context, the background to what we want to talk about. Because I think when we look at what's happening to consumer behavior, we get to see what the implications of these macroeconomic trends are for your business. And one of the important things to talk about here is around people's behavior, because when we see consumer confidence falling, people start to save more. And this is the total level of private personal savings in Ireland going back to 2003 up to Q3 2011. Right now, or as of the latest figures from the central bank, consumer spending or consumer savings in Ireland totaled some 87 billion euro sitting in Irish bank accounts. There's more sitting outside of Ireland. Obviously, it's fallen back from its peak in the middle of 2009, people drawing down their savings, using them to pay off debts, etc. But the fact is, we've built up this huge amount of savings in the economy, and that level of savings is, I think, it's driven obviously by the precautionary incentive, the rainy day fund for people, but it also is a pointer to, I think, one of the factors that could unlock significant growth in Ireland when we get that return to growth in the future. Excuse me. When will that happen? Well, let's take that as a given and look at the prospects for growth going into the future. What we've done on this particular chart here is plotted total income, which if you take the height of each bar, that's total disposable income in Ireland, or total income in Ireland. Then you take away the green part, which is taxation, and that leaves you with disposable income, after-tax income. And what do we do with our after-tax income? We spend it, which is the blue bar, or we save it, which is the red part of the bar. And what you can see here is up to 2011, 2012, this year, it's coming down to about 81 billion euros spend this year, down from a peak of nearly 94 billion in spend in 2008. So that's a very sharp contraction in spending. Obviously, we've also seen income tax take of disposable incomes going up for all the budgetary reasons we're familiar with. But I think the interesting thing is what's happening in between. And what's extraordinary is the level of savings that are taking place in Ireland at the moment. This year, consumers will save nearly 11 billion euro out of their lower after-tax income as a result of psychological and other perceptions about the current economy and about the future. And this is very important because contrast that pattern, and here we have projected it on the basis of very modest prospects for income growth out to 2016, when you see consumer spending growing to nearly 88 billion again. But even over the next 4 years or thereabouts, the level of savings in the economy will remain huge, 10 billion euro a year in savings each year out of disposable incomes. Contrast that with the much lower levels of savings out of higher levels of income that we saw obviously in 2006, 2007 and indeed 2008 during the boom. What does this tell us? Well, I think what's interesting is that what's happening to consumer behavior now is that a lot of these savings they're driven, of course, not so much by economic necessity, but by perceptions, emotions, feelings, confidence about the future. If we were only saving at the rate that we were saving in terms of the savings ratio during the first part of the noughties of the start of the first decade of the century, then we would be saving considerably less on this monthly basis. If we actually were saving the same ratio this year, something like 5 billion of that 10 billion would be spent if we were back to the level of savings that we had pre-recessionary times. In fact, something like a cumulative 30 billion between now and 2016 will be saved above what would normally be saved That's an awful lot of extra spending power that's out there accumulating in the marketplace at the moment. On top of that, you'll also have a lot of pent-up spending, cyclical spending that's gone unmet as people have deferred car purchases or house purchases or indeed replacing furniture and so on. We reckon maybe another 20 billion. So there you have something like 50 billion in extra spending power that could be drawn down by consumers when recovery kicks in, when they feel that they've dodged the bullet in terms of all the adverse consequences of the recession. So this is very important in terms of anticipating opportunities. Sure, the value of spending by your customers will grow from about 81 billion to nearly 88 billion over the next 4 years, on the basis of very modest growth assumptions, by the way. But they'll still be saving. So one of the big challenges, I guess, for marketers, those not in the financial services sector who are very happy with this trend and people depositing money, but for the rest of us trying to encourage people to spend, the challenge there around what could you do to persuade people now to unlock some of that rainy day fund rather than wait until later. So that's a big opportunity and one of the big differences between Britain and Ireland, because the savings ratio in Ireland traditionally has always been much higher than in the UK, but in fact it has gone up enormously, whereas in the UK it's remained relatively low and indeed has even started to come down again as their economic prospects have improved. It's not just economic prospects that are different between the two countries. Look at demography here. All I've done here is plot the change in the number of people in each of these 5-year age groups over 15, from 15 to 19 right through to 85 and over. And this is the rate of change in the past 10 years, 2000 to 2010. What you see is the green bar for Ireland, the blue bar for Britain. And what's interesting, first of all, is at the very top here, total population in Ireland has grown at more than twice the rate of the growth of population in the UK. But when you split out different age groups, something very radically different is happening in the two markets. The number of teenagers and young adults in Ireland has in fact contracted. The green bars are over there to the left of the axis, whereas their numbers have been going up in the UK. In fact, Britain's going through something of a teenage boom at the moment. So a very different demographic profile for the two countries. Roll it on a little bit further down within the circle and you get a huge growth in Ireland in the late 20s, early 30s population. And what that means in Ireland is that we actually have a baby boom happening in Ireland right now. Our birth rate's going up, the number of births, it remains very high relative to the UK, which is a much more modest rate of growth in population. So you can see some similarities and differences here. But I would stress this is really important for businesses like yours who are perhaps engaged with colleagues in the UK or with media buyers or with advertising agencies trying to communicate similar or different messages to the two markets. The demographic realities are perhaps even more different than the economic realities in terms of these forces, these factors shaping prospects. So as you plan for recovery, as you plan for opportunity and growth in your market in Ireland, the demographic realities are going to be very different, as are the economic realities. So these abstract but nevertheless important macro perspectives are very important and tell us a key story about the differences as well as the similarities between Britain and Ireland. So maybe just to sum up this part of the presentation. Demography is destiny. Ireland has a middle-aging population, which is resulting in this surge in the number of young families. Very different dynamic to the UK. We have a high savings ratio that looks likely to come down at a very slow rate over the next number of years. Even as the economy recovers, people will retain that caution they've acquired in recent years. There is a huge pent-up rainy day fund. We estimate it could be 30 to 50 billion euro by 2016. That could be drawn down for a lot of replacement purchases, for a lot of cyclical purchases as recovery becomes more definitive into the future. But confidence and indeed the economy still have to pick up, particularly the domestic economy, and that is the reality we still all have to face this year as we plan for opportunities and we adjust to the realities of the market situation. As for the UK, different population, they have a more aging population profile, but in parallel to that, they also have this teenage youth surge that's happening right now, and that's very important in terms of their market prospects, their market realities. But they have a low savings ratio. The macroeconomic situation is different. They've had more of a recession. We've had more of a textbook economic depression. So they have a very different mindset as consumers. So they've experienced less of an economic shock, but they are also, like ourselves, still weak in terms of consumer confidence. The economic prospects are still modest at best, and so confidence will only return very slowly, very gradually as the economy starts to pick up. So that's really just the context in terms of the macro picture, in terms of the similarities and the differences. But we've been along very divergent paths in the course of this recession, and certainly I would expect us to continue along divergent paths, not least because of demography, even as both economies return to a path of recovery and of growth. So that's the macro picture. What else can we say about the consumer and the consumers in Britain and Ireland and the differences between them? I suppose the first thing I'd have to draw attention to is one of the key findings in relation to the issue of trust. Because it hasn't just been our economy that has been rocked by the recession, it has been many of the institutions that for so long provided structure, guidance, authority in both British and Irish society. What's happening now is that a lot of institutions, a lot of organisations, even a lot of businesses, a bit like poor Ben Stiller here in Meet the Parents, they're outside the circle of trust. And I would say that many of us in business are now outside the circle of trust in terms of where consumers are at in terms of who they trust, who they look to for guidance, for authority, and for direction. We see this in our research. One of the questions that we asked in our survey was a survey of 1,000 adults in Britain and Ireland last year. To what extent do you trust the following organisations to be honest and fair? The lower part of the bar is the UK answers, the upper part of the bar is the Republic of Ireland answers. Which of them do you trust? Don't trust at all, trust a little, trust somewhat, trust a great deal. 18% trust, I'm glad to say, the Post Office a great deal. Is very good news for our sponsor, very good news for the Royal Mail as well, in terms of that level of trust. Others also doing very well. You can see the balance of trust over to the right versus distrust over to the left. The Gardaí or the police in Britain. Google, also very high level of trust. Utility companies, big difference here. Obviously, deregulation in the UK has left a lot of consumers with the sour feeling or sour taste in the mouth about deregulation in the utility sector. Not so in Ireland, still more likely to trust than not trust. Supermarkets, broadly similar picture. But Irish businesses generally, or UK British businesses generally, it's okay. Some sitting on the fence. There's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. But it's really important to recognise that trust is something that has been rocked by the crises that we've been through, by the shock to people's experiences of banks, of businesses, of government, of the media, and so on. This is a crucial issue because what we are finding now is that the collapse of trust, it's happened in Britain, it's happened in Ireland, is obviously hurting businesses in terms of customer loyalty, but it's also opening up opportunity in terms of challenger brands, challenger startups. I mean, look at Google and how trusted it is now relative to supermarkets or indeed utility companies. These are just indications, and there are other organisations in the report, but these are just indications of the shock to trust that has happened through the crisis, through the recession, certainly since 2007, 2008. And you can see it's kind of accelerating. We track the Net Promoter Score across different sectors. Here are the two net promoter scores for 2010 to 2011 by different sectors: credit unions, supermarkets, mobile phones, health insurance, the main bank. These are just the results for Ireland, by the way. We track it in our monthly omnibus. And what we found was that there's been a deterioration in the trust, the net promoter score, in terms of those who would recommend versus those who would not recommend. Those you'd be familiar with the score. A negative score isn't unusual, but a deteriorating negative score is alarming. And what we're finding is that and across most categories, the net promoter score is one indication of loyalty, one indication of trust, and of the health of relationships between businesses and their customers has deteriorated quite sharply. And that's important because it tells us something about what's happening to consumers in Ireland. They're not only feeling hurt by their economy, they're not only getting a bit older because of demography, they're also changing their worldview, their mindset about businesses and who is inside that circle of trust and who is outside that circle of trust. And for a lot of businesses, they're losing the love of their customers, and that's a source of real concern. Stepping back from the generic categories, what about media? One of the things that we were very interested in exploring in the research was the extent to which British and Irish consumers trust different media in terms of advertising and believing in the advertising or trusting the advertising delivered to them through different media channels. Well, one of the big standouts here, as you can see, is radio. In terms of the mass media, radio, very high level of trust in Ireland versus the UK. Still a high level of trust in the UK, I might add, in terms of the balance of those who trust it a little or a lot versus those who don't trust the media. But you can see a big difference there in the level of trust. Likewise in terms of newspapers. But in terms of the direct media, we also have very significant differences in terms of trust in, say, personalised letters or leaflets in the post addressed to individuals, where we get much higher percentages here, over 4 in 10 adults in Ireland trusting advertising or marketing communications via that particular channel versus about less than a third trusting it in the UK. So we have this dynamic around trust, whether it's net promoter score or other measures, is carrying through into how consumers in Britain and Ireland respond to their media. And I think it also tells us something here about how you can engage consumers differently in Ireland through Irish media, because clearly the relationships, radio and newspapers in particular, TV of course with the RTE dynamic, are very much local, regional or Irish national media. And so that level of trust is something there that seems to have been fairly resilient to the knock to trust and to authority that we've seen across other institutions in recent years. There are a couple of other interesting differences in terms of, for example, access to channels. One of the big standout here is landline access. Here, 3 in 10 adults in Ireland don't have access to a landline because, of course, they've adopted mobile. That has now become the de facto for a growing minority of the population. The UK, very different dynamic there. We had a much lower access to landlines in Ireland historically through the 80s and 90s. The legacy of that, when you overlay the impact of mobile, of course, is that now we haven't reached saturation in landline usage. So these differences also play out in terms of their impact on the consumer and how you reach them. There are a couple of other important factors also to be aware of. 8 out of 10 adults in Ireland are online. Not many people realise that at the height of the Celtic Tiger boom in 2007, only a minority of people in Ireland were using the internet. About 46, 47%. It was still a minority of people were using the internet. Despite the recession, despite the shock to GDP and GNP and consumer spending that we've all seen, internet usage has gone up and up and up. Now 8 out of 10 adults in 2012 are using the internet. Half of all adults are now using Facebook. And 10% are using Twitter. About 30% at the end of last year had smartphones. We expect it to reach 50% by the end of this year. The dynamic is so rapid. It's a Facebook type of dynamic. It's really growing very, very rapidly. And 6 out of 10 adults have bought something online in Ireland. So we have despite the recession and despite that particular dynamic of impacting consumer spending, behavior has continued to change. People have adjusted to the potential of the web, of smartphones, etc., to get better value, to get access to new services, to interact and to relate to brands differently, despite the pressure on their spending power.